My name is Thomas Vance. I'm 47 years old. For 20 of those years, I served in the Army, most of it with the 75th Ranger Regiment. When I got out, I didn't know what to do with myself. The civilian world felt loud and flimsy. The only place that ever felt as real and as honest as a combat zone was the deep wilderness. So that's where I went. I became a wilderness guide, specializing in multi-day survival and tracking trips deep in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. I thought I knew those woods. I thought I understood the rules, the dangers. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago. I haven't been back into the forest since. I haven't told this story to anyone who didn't dismiss it as trauma-induced fantasy. But it was real, and the people I lost were real. The trip was supposed to be a standard 5-day excursion. It was late October, the air crisp, the leaves turning those impossible shades of orange and crimson. My partner, Cal, was with me. Cal was as solid as the granite cliffs we sometimes scaled. He was a former smoke jumper, calm under pressure, with a dry sense of humor that could diffuse any tense situation. We'd worked together for 6 years and trusted each other implicitly. We had 3 clients. There was a couple, Corey and Megan. Corey was a former Marine, quiet, observant, and physically capable. He carried himself with a coiled stillness that I recognized. Megan was his opposite. She was anxious, new to the outdoors, and clearly doing this for him. She flinched at every snapping twig. Then there was Brian. Brian was a corporate lawyer from some city back east, loud, affable, and convinced his weekend warrior status made him an expert. He had all the best gear, but none of the instincts. We set off from the trailhead near Haw Creek Falls, hiking north into the upper Buffalo wilderness. The first day was perfect. The sun was warm, the trail was clear, and Brian's endless stream of bad jokes was still more amusing than annoying. We made camp in a familiar spot, a small clearing by a stream, miles from any road. The night passed uneventfully. The usual sounds of the forest lulled us to sleep, the hoot of a barred owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the oaks and hickories. It was normal. It was safe. That feeling of safety was the first thing to be taken from us. The second day started the same, but around noon, the feeling of the woods began to change. It started with silence. If you've spent enough time in a truly wild place, you know its rhythm. There's a constant hum of life. Birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the drone of insects. But that afternoon, it all just stopped. The silence fell like a blanket, thick and suffocating. Even the wind seemed to die down. Cal and I exchanged a look. He felt it too. His hand rested near the handle of the large, fixed-blade knife on his belt. Corey, the Marine, had stopped walking and was slowly scanning the trees, his head tilted as if listening for something he couldn't quite hear. "What's up?" Brian asked, his voice jarringly loud in the stillness. "Why'd we stop?" "Just taking a breather," Cal said, his voice easy, but his eyes were tight. "Listen." Brian stood there for a moment, looking confused. "Listen to what? I don't hear anything." "Exactly," I said softly. Megan was clutching Corey's arm, her eyes wide. She could feel it too. It was the kind of primal silence that precedes a predator. We stood there for a full 5 minutes, frozen in a tableau of quiet dread. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound returned. A blue jay shrieked from a nearby branch, and the spell was broken. But the feeling of being watched, of something being profoundly wrong, lingered in the air like a bad smell. An hour later, we found the deer. We smelled it first, the coppery, gut-wrenching stench of blood and viscera. It was just off the trail, a large doe, but it wasn't a clean kill. A bear or a mountain lion will typically eat the organs first, the most nutrient-rich parts. They don't waste much. This was different. This was carnage. The doe had been literally torn in half. Its rib cage was splayed open, the bones snapped like twigs. One leg was ripped from its socket and lay 20 feet away. The head was twisted at an impossible angle, the neck broken. But very little of it had been eaten. It was an act of extreme, explosive violence, not predation. "My God," Megan whispered, turning her face into Corey's shoulder. Brian, for once, was silent. He just stared, his face pale. Cal and I circled the carcass, our boots squelching in the blood-soaked leaves. "No bear did this," Cal said, his voice a low growl. "A bear would have fed. And look at the tracks." He pointed. The ground was too disturbed to get a perfect print, but what we could see was unsettling. There were huge, deep impressions, but they were elongated, not round like a bear's paw. And they were paired, suggesting something that had stood on two legs while it tore the animal apart. "What the hell?" I muttered, crouching down. I saw something else that made the hair on my arms stand up. There were claw marks on a nearby beech tree, deep gouges in the bark. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, but they weren't the parallel slashes of a bear sharpening its claws. It looked more like something had slammed its hand against the tree in a rage. "Maybe a pack of coyotes got to it after something else killed it," Brian offered, his voice shaky. He was trying to fit it into a box he could understand. "Coyotes don't snap femurs," Corey said, his voice flat. He hadn't taken his eyes off the surrounding woods. "And they don't tear limbs off for fun." He was right. This was wrong. All of it. We decided to move on, and quickly. The image of that shredded deer, the unnatural violence of it, was burned into my mind. The woods no longer felt like home. They felt hostile, alien. We pushed on, trying to put some distance between us and that place. We made camp earlier than planned, in a more defensible position on a slight rise, with a rock face to our back and a clear view of the woods in front of us. Nobody was joking anymore. The mood was somber. We built a larger fire than usual, its light pushing back the encroaching darkness. Cal and I decided one of us would stay on watch through the night. We didn't say what we were watching for. We didn't have to. The night started quietly. Too quietly. The normal nocturnal sounds were absent again. Just a dead, listening silence. I took the first watch. Cal, Corey, and Brian were in their tents. Megan was too scared to be alone, so she and Corey were zipped into one. I sat on a log near the fire, my 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs resting across my lap. I felt a familiar tension, the same heightened awareness I'd felt on night patrols in Afghanistan. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Around midnight, I heard the first definitive sound. A heavy twig snap, far out in the darkness, well beyond the firelight. Too heavy for a raccoon or a fox. I froze, straining my ears. Silence. Then, a few minutes later, another sound. A low, guttural grunt. It wasn't a bear. I've heard hundreds of bears. Their grunts are throaty, almost like a cough. This was deeper, more resonant, with a weird, wet quality to it, like air being forced through fluid-filled lungs. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I slowly stood up, keeping the shotgun leveled toward the darkness. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs,
a slow, heavy drumbeat.
I scanned the tree line, but the firelight created a wall of light that made it impossible to see beyond. The darkness was absolute, a solid black curtain. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It was moving, paralleling our camp. And it wasn't alone. I heard a second one on the opposite side of the clearing. They were coordinating. A faint rustling sound came from near Megan and Corey's tent. I swung the shotgun around, my finger tightening on the trigger. Megan let out a small, terrified gasp from inside. Something had brushed against the nylon. Corey's voice was a harsh whisper from inside the tent. "Get back. Get away from the wall." The flap of Cal's tent unzipped. He emerged, his handgun in his hand, his face a grim mask in the firelight. "What is it?" he mouthed. I just shook my head, holding a finger to my lips. We stood there, back to back, scanning the impenetrable darkness that surrounded our tiny island of light. We could hear them moving, a heavy, deliberate tread, not the 4-beat gait of a quadruped. This was a 2-beat rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of something heavy walking on 2 legs. Brian's tent unzipped. "What's all the noise?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Is it a bear?" "Get back in your tent, Brian," I said, my voice low and urgent, "and stay quiet." "It's probably just a deer," he mumbled, but the fear in the air was palpable now, and he retreated back inside. For the next hour, they toyed with us. They would circle the camp, just at the edge of the firelight. We'd hear a low growl from one side, then a soft thump as a rock or a piece of wood was tossed into the clearing from the other. They were testing us. They were intelligent. This wasn't some dumb animal drawn by the smell of food. This was a calculated psychological assault. They were trying to panic us. And with Megan, they were succeeding. We could hear her muffled sobs from inside the tent. Cal had a high-powered LED flashlight, a beam so bright it could turn night into day for 100 yards. "I'm going to try and get a look," he whispered. "Don't," I said. "They want us to." "We need to know what we're dealing with, Tom," he insisted. He was right. The not knowing was almost as bad as the fear itself. He raised the flashlight, pointing it toward the spot where we'd last heard movement. He thumbed the switch. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating a thicket of rhododendron. For a second, there was nothing. Then, something moved. It was at the very edge of the beam, maybe 60 yards out. It was huge, far bigger than a man. It had been crouched down, but as the light hit it, it rose. Not on all fours. It rose up on 2 legs. It was just a silhouette against the deeper black of the woods, but it was enough. The shoulders were immense, impossibly broad. The head was large and vaguely canine, with pointed ears silhouetted against the light. It stood there for a single, heart-stopping second, a towering figure of nightmare anatomy. Then, with a speed that defied its bulk, it ducked back into the trees and was gone. Cal let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He lowered the flashlight, his hand trembling slightly. "Did you see that?" "I saw it," I said. My blood had turned to ice water. All the stories you hear, the campfire tales, the blurry photos on the internet, you dismiss them. You're a rational person. You know the woods. There are bears, mountain lions, wolves. There are not 7-foot-tall bipedal canids. But we had just seen one, and there were at least 2 of them, and they were hunting us. The psychological games stopped. The testing was over. The real attack began with a terrifying display of coordinated tactics.
A large rock, the size of a bowling ball, arced out of the darkness and slammed into the ground just feet from the fire, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the air.
Megan screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. At the same instant, a horrendous, ear-splitting howl erupted from the opposite side of the camp. It was a sound that vibrated in your bones, a predatory cry filled with hate and hunger. It was a classic diversion. Our heads, our weapons, all snapped towards the howl, and in that split second of distraction, the first one attacked from the direction the rock had come from. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly terrifying for something so massive. It didn't rush into the firelight. It burst from the darkness and went straight for the nearest tent. Brian's tent. "Hey, get out of here!" Brian yelled, unzipping his tent flap, still operating under the fatal delusion that he was dealing with a normal animal. He stepped out, waving his arms. "Go on, get!" The creature was on him before he could finish the word.
In the flickering firelight, I saw it clearly for the first time, and my mind simply refused to process it for a second. It was built like a steroidal wolf forced onto a human chassis. It stood easily 7.5 feet tall, with massive, muscle-corded shoulders and disproportionately long arms that terminated in large, human-like hands tipped with thick, black claws. Its legs were bent backward like a dog's, but it moved on them with a bipedal gait that was both jarringly unnatural and terrifyingly effective. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, matted with what looked like dried mud and blood. But the head was the worst part. It was a nightmare fusion of wolf and hyena, with a long snout filled with yellow, dagger-like teeth. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent, yellow-green light, and they were fixed on Brian with an unmistakable, predatory intelligence. It didn't maul him. It didn't bite him. It grabbed him.
One of its huge, clawed hands seized Brian by the chest, the other by his head.
Brian made a choked, gurgling sound. The creature lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. There was a sickening, wet crunch, and Brian's body went limp. The creature twisted, and with a flick of its monstrous shoulders, it threw Brian's broken form 20 feet into the darkness. It all happened in less than 3 seconds. Megan's scream was cut short as Corey clamped a hand over her mouth, pulling her behind him. He had a large hunting knife in his hand, his knuckles white. "Back to the rocks," he yelled, his voice cutting through my shock. "Form a line." His Marine training had kicked in, an automatic response to ambush. Cal was already firing his pistol. Pop, pop, pop. The 9mm rounds sounded like toys. The creature that had killed Brian barely flinched. It just turned its head, its glowing eyes fixing on Cal.
It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. Then it took a step toward him. I finally broke free from my paralysis. I raised the shotgun and fired. The 12-gauge slug hit the creature square in the chest. The impact was immense. It staggered back a step, a real, solid hit. It roared, a sound of fury and pain this time, and clutched at its chest. Dark blood oozed between its claws, but it didn't go down. Any man, any bear, would have been knocked off its feet or killed outright. This thing just looked angry. That's when the second one attacked. It came from the direction of the howl, charging straight for the fire. It was slightly smaller than the first, but just as fast. It didn't target us. It targeted our only defense. With a powerful leap, it cleared the log I had been sitting on and landed right next to the fire. It swiped a long arm through the flames, scattering logs and embers across the campsite. Our circle of light was instantly diminished, plunging the edges of the clearing into shadow. "Don't let them put it out," Cal yelled, firing at the second creature. This one was quicker. It ducked and weaved, the bullets kicking up dirt around its feet. It moved with a horrifying purpose. It grabbed the ripped remains of Brian's tent and tried to drag it over the dwindling flames. Corey shoved Megan toward the rock face behind us. "Stay there, don't move," he commanded. He moved to my side, his knife held low. "We can't let them flank us." I chambered another round. The first creature, the one I'd shot, was recovering. It was growling, its eyes locked on me. It started to advance again, moving low, using the new shadows for cover. The intelligence was undeniable. This was not a frenzied animal attack. This was a coordinated assault by a pair of highly efficient predators. They were dismantling our defenses, neutralizing our light source, and preparing to pick us off one by one. I fired again. This time I aimed for the head. The creature was moving, and in the shifting light my shot went high, tearing a chunk of bark from a tree behind it. The second one had succeeded in smothering most of the fire. We were now in a small, flickering circle of light, no more than 10 feet across. The darkness was pressing in, and we could hear them moving in it, circling us, their low growls a constant, terrifying chorus. Cal was out of ammo. "Reloading," he yelled, fumbling with a spare magazine. The larger creature chose that moment to charge. It wasn't a blind rush. It came at us from a 45-degree angle, forcing me and Corey to split our attention. It was aiming for Cal while he was vulnerable. "Cal, move!" I screamed, trying to bring my shotgun around. But the thing was impossibly fast. It covered 30 feet in what felt like a single bound. It didn't go for a killing blow. It swiped its long arm, and the claws caught the side of Cal's handgun, ripping it from his grasp and sending it spinning into the night. It then backhanded him across the chest. The blow sent Cal flying backward. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up. Now it was just me and Corey. Megan was whimpering against the rocks behind us. The two creatures stood at the edge of the dying firelight, their yellow eyes glowing with triumphant malice. They weren't rushing in. They were savoring it. They knew they had us. The larger one, with the slug wound in its chest, took a slow step forward. Its snout wrinkled, exposing its terrifying teeth in what looked chillingly like a grin. "This is it," Corey said beside me, his voice strangely calm. "Aim for the head. Don't stop shooting until you're empty." He was a Marine. He wasn't going to die cowering. As the larger one gathered itself to leap, Corey did something I never would have expected. He charged. He didn't scream or yell. He just ran straight at the monster, his knife held in a reverse grip. It was a suicidal, desperate, and incredibly brave act. The creature was momentarily surprised. It had expected fear, not a direct assault. It raised its arms to grab him, but Corey was faster than it anticipated. He ducked under its grasp and drove his knife deep into its thigh. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, a sound completely different from its growls, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. It bucked, trying to throw him off, but Corey held on, twisting the blade. The second creature, seeing its partner injured, lunged for Corey. I had a clear shot. I fired the shotgun, and the slug caught the second one in the shoulder. It spun around, howling, its arm hanging uselessly at its side. The first creature, enraged, finally got a hold of Corey. It grabbed him by the back of his jacket and lifted him into the air. Corey was still stabbing at its leg, but the creature ignored him. It opened its massive jaws and bit down on Corey's shoulder. The sound of bone crunching was the loudest thing I have ever heard. But even as he was being savaged, Corey did one last thing. With his free hand, he reached up and drove the thumb of his knife hilt deep into the creature's eye. The monster screamed, a sound so agonizing and shrill it made my teeth ache. It dropped Corey and staggered back, clawing at its ruined eye socket from which a thick black fluid was pouring. The other creature, clutching its wounded shoulder, let out a series of sharp, clicking growls. It was a retreat signal. The injured one stumbled over to its partner. The one with the ruined eye gave us one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then they both turned and melted back into the darkness. The silence that followed was more profound than any I had ever experienced. It was a vacuum, a total absence of sound. Then Megan started screaming. I ran to Corey. He was on the ground, a mangled wreck.
His shoulder and half his chest were gone, but he was still alive. His eyes were open, looking at me. "Get her out," he rasped, blood bubbling from his lips. "Go, now." I looked over at Cal. He was unconscious but breathing. I knew I couldn't carry them both. I couldn't even carry one of them and fight. Corey knew it too. "Go," he insisted, his voice already fading. That was for Megan. I made a choice. It's a choice that has haunted every single day of my life since. I grabbed Megan. She was catatonic with terror, a dead weight. I half dragged, half carried her away from the ruins of our camp, away from the two men who had saved our lives. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We ran. We crashed through the undergrowth, thorns and branches tearing at our skin and clothes. I had no idea where we were going. I just ran downhill, hoping to find a stream, a river, anything that could lead us out. Behind us, I heard a single, final, agonized scream from the direction of the camp. I knew it was Cal. Then silence. After a few minutes, I heard the sounds of pursuit, the heavy, bipedal footfalls crashing through the woods behind us. They were coming for us. That flight through the forest is a blur of pure, primal terror. I dragged Megan along, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The sounds behind us would get closer, then fade, as if they were toying with us, herding us. I felt like a rabbit being run down by hounds. I had my shotgun, but only 2 shells left. I knew it wouldn't be enough. We stumbled into a creek bed, and I made a decision. I followed it downstream, splashing through the freezing water, hoping it would cover our scent. Megan was stumbling, falling, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fall back. Maybe the water was working. We waded through the darkness for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into our bones, our bodies numb with exhaustion and shock. Just as the first hint of gray light began to filter through the canopy, we stumbled out of the woods and onto a gravel road. It was a logging road, unmarked and remote, but it was a sign of civilization. It was a sign of hope. We were 50 feet down the road when we heard it one last time. That hate-filled, predatory howl, echoing from the ridge we had just ascended. It wasn't a sound of pursuit. It was a sound of frustration. A declaration that this wasn't over. Then silence. We collapsed onto the gravel. I held Megan as she shook uncontrollably. We sat there, 2 broken people on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere, as the sun came up. An hour later, a logging truck came rumbling down the road. The driver, a big man with a kind face, saw us. The look on his face, a mixture of shock and pity, is something I will never forget. He wrapped us in blankets, gave us water, and called the sheriff on his satellite phone. The escape was over. The next nightmare was about to begin.
The sheriff's deputies met the logging truck at the main highway. They separated me and Megan immediately.
I was taken to the county seat, to a small, sterile interview room. I was exhausted, in shock, and covered in scratches and bruises, but I was coherent. I was a trained observer. I told them everything, just as I've told you. I started with the silence, the deer, the sounds in the night. I described the creatures in meticulous detail, their size, their anatomy, their intelligence, their tactical coordination. I described Brian's death, Corey's charge, Cal's sacrifice. I told them exactly where our campsite was. The two deputies listening to me were a young, eager cop and an older, paunchy sergeant with tired eyes. The young one scribbled notes furiously. The sergeant just listened, his face an unreadable mask. When I finished, the room was silent.
The sergeant leaned forward. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "you've been through a major trauma. A bear attack is a terrifying thing." "It wasn't a bear," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "I've seen bears. I've hunted bears. I shot one of these things with a 12-gauge slug at 20 yards. It took the hit and it kept coming. Does that sound like a black bear to you?" "Sometimes, under stress, the mind can play tricks on you," the young deputy offered, trying to be helpful. "It magnifies things." "Did it magnify the 3 men who are dead or missing back there?" I shot back. "Listen to me. There are 2 of them. They are smart. When your people go in there, they need to be armed. Heavily. They need to go in force." The sergeant held up a hand. "We'll handle the recovery, Mr. Vance. Why don't you let the paramedics check you out?" He was dismissing me. He had already decided what had happened. It was the only story that fit into his world, a tragic but explainable animal attack. My story was impossible, and therefore, it wasn't true. They found the campsite, of course. They recovered the bodies of Brian and Corey. Cal's body was found a quarter-mile away. The official report was released a week later. The cause of death for all 3 was animal attack, consistent with a large black bear. The report mentioned that I was suffering from shock and that my fantastical account was likely a symptom of post-traumatic stress. Megan was no help. She was so traumatized she couldn't give a coherent statement, just fragments of screaming and darkness. They used her condition to further invalidate my testimony. My shotgun was found at the scene. It had been fired, which they said was consistent with me trying to defend the group from a bear. They never found the slug I'd fired into the creature's chest. They never found the creature's blood. They explained the lack of a bear carcass by saying the animal was likely wounded and had wandered off to die. Case closed. They made me a problem that they could file away. They ignored the evidence that didn't fit. The sheer destructive force. The way Brian's neck was snapped. The fact that Cal's handgun had been bent, its steel frame twisted by an impossible force. Corey's knife was still embedded in the ground, its blade broken. They cataloged it all, but they didn't see it. They only saw what they expected to see. A few days later, as I was getting ready to leave town, a man approached me outside my motel room. He was old, probably in his late 70s, wearing the faded uniform of a park ranger, though he looked long past retirement. He introduced himself as having been with the Forest Service for 40 years in that area. "I read the sheriff's report," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "And I heard what you told them. I braced myself for another lecture on trauma and bears. You need to listen to me," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "You don't ever go back there. You hear me? Not ever. That patch of woods, from Haw Creek north to the Buffalo River, it's wrong. Always has been." I just stared at him, speechless. "They call it a bear attack," he continued, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the pavement. "They called it that in '98 when those 2 hikers vanished from their tent. They called it that in '85 when they found that logger torn to pieces. Called it that in '72
when a whole family disappeared from their camper. Always a bear. A big, aggressive, unusually clever bear that they never managed to find. He paused, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure we were alone. There are things in those hills, son. Old things. The first people knew about them. They knew which places to stay away from. We've forgotten. We think because we have maps and GPS that we own the world. We don't. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a deep, profound sadness in his eyes. What you saw, you saw. It was real. You're not crazy. But you won't get anyone with a badge to ever admit it. It's easier to write a report about a bear. It keeps the tourists coming. It keeps the world simple. So you take this as a gift. You got out. Most don't. Now go home, and don't ever come back to these mountains. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing there in the parking lot. He hadn't solved anything. He hadn't offered any answers. But he had given me something I desperately needed. Validation. I wasn't crazy. It was real. And I was a survivor of something ancient and terrible that the modern world had chosen to forget. That was 3 years ago. I did what he said. I went home. I sold my business. I sold my gear. I can't even stand to be in a city park after dusk. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the way shadows play at the edge of a streetlight. It brings it all back. I have nightmares every night. I see that creature's glowing yellow eyes. I hear the sound of bone snapping. I feel the guilt of leaving Cal and Corey behind, a cold, heavy stone in my gut that will never go away. Survivor's guilt, the therapist called it. But it feels more like the guilt of a coward. I live in a small apartment now, in the middle of a city, surrounded by concrete and steel and the noise of millions of people. I need the noise. I can't stand the silence. The silence is when you hear things. I lost everything that night. I lost my friends. I lost my livelihood. I lost the only place in the world where I ever felt at peace. The woods were my sanctuary, my church. Now, when I close my eyes, the forest is a place of gaping jaws and predatory intelligence. I don't know why I'm telling this story now. Maybe because the official narrative, the lie about the bear, is the final insult to the men who died. Cal, Brian, and Corey weren't killed by an animal. They were killed by monsters, intelligent, tactical monsters who hunt human beings for sport or for territory. Brian died because of his arrogance. Corey died because of his bravery. And Cal died trying to save me. They deserve to have the truth told, even if no one believes it. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from any road, and the world suddenly goes quiet, if you feel that primal dread creep up your spine, don't rationalize it. Don't dismiss it. Listen to that feeling. It's the oldest part of your brain, the part that still remembers when we weren't at the top of the food chain. It's telling you to run, because there are things in the dark, forgotten corners of this world that are older, stronger, and far more intelligent than we can comprehend. They are real, and if you're lucky, the only proof you'll ever have is a story that no one will ever believe.